Special Operations Training Detachment, SOT-D West, Burrow Team. Coming at you from NTC, Off the Radar.
This is Off the Radar. I'm Captain Weston Rich, an observer coach trainer for the Green Berets at the National Training Center. Welcome to this special collaboration with WarDocs, the Military Medicine Podcast. In this two-part episode, Burrow Team's Sergeant First Class Mondrian Bogert returns to discuss Special Operations Medicine and the integration of medical training at the Combat Training Centers with Chief Master Sergeant Retired Steve Cum and Colonel Retired Doug Soderall of WarDocs. So let's dive in.
Today, we're privileged to welcome Army 18 Delta Special Forces Medical Sergeant, Sergeant First Class Mondrian Bogert to WarDocs. Mo, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, Mo. Great to see you and great to chat with you.
Thank as well, Steve.
Can you tell us a little bit about your pathway to joining the Army in 2012 and what really made you become interested in being a medic that you are?
Yeah, so just kind of provide some background. So right around kind of like that 2012 mark, I was attending Regis University in Colorado. That's where I grew up and I was born. Currently at the time, I was going through a double major in finance and economics. I was about 3.5 years in, and kind of I colloquially call it my quarter life crisis, so to speak, because I was about 23 when I made the decision. It kind of dawned on me that this is not the path that I want to go down. I was kind of studying to be a portfolio manager, and I honestly just kind of wanted something a little bit more out of my life, something a little bit more fulfilling than just sitting in front of a computer for 14 hours a day. Yes, I would be very profitable, but at the same time, would I actually get fulfillment out of my life? At the time, I'd gotten a little bit more into fitness. I'd kind of taken a keen interest in my brother's career path. At the time, he was one of the lead nurses at a hospital just in kind of around my hometown. So kind of a little bit learning more into what he dealt with on a day-to-day basis as far as trauma patients, sitting in the ER and working with the docs. So I think my desire to kind of break away from a so-called white-collar job and then more interested in medicine kind of drove me to kind of look through, okay, what are my options as far as that's concerned? I'm looking for something to challenge myself. I'm looking for an environment where I can work with a group of individuals who are as like-minded as I am and who want to be able to push themselves on a daily basis and kind of push the boundaries of what is expected of a normal person, honestly, is really what it came down to. So options were kind of limited. I was looking at the Special Forces realm and kind of learned, the breakdown of the MOSs within the Army Special Forces regimen. Found the 18 Delta. That really interests me. So I kind of started doing a little bit more research and found that there was what's known as the 18 X-ray contract and for those that aren't available, basically what it is you you attend Army basic training, you go through OSIT, which is the AIT portion of it, and then you go straight to Airborne school, and then straight up from Airborne school, you go right into Special Forces assessment and selection. So you essentially start the pipeline directly out of basic training. So that was kind of my gateway into that realm. And that's kind of essentially in short words, how I made the decision of this is a path that I want to go down. Granted, it's not the most profitable in the world. It certainly would have made a lot more money as a portfolio manager. But honestly, I knew it was going to be one of those things where I would appreciate my job more and appreciate the people that I work with a lot more.
So one of the things that you did following, training to be an 18 Delta, one of your recent assignments has been as an observer, controller, trainer, and senior 18 Delta at the National Training Center under the Special Operations Training Battalion West. How would you compare the depth and intensity of training of an 18 Delta Special Forces medic to that of a conventional combat medic, particularly when you're preparing for those unique challenges of soft missions?
So kind of and this is, I'm glad you actually brought that up, Doug, just because it's kind of a common question, especially from people who aren't really keen on the differences between what you would consider like a 68 whiskey or regular Army medic versus an actual soft medic, just because they're not privy to the pipeline that we actually go through. So the way that I kind of break it down and try to simplify it is a difference of prescriptive medicine versus predictive medicine. And so, the majority of trauma medicine that like a 68 whiskey is going to see is pretty much all the interventions that you do as far as trauma medicine is concerned. At point of injury they're all stopgaps. Let's be honest, for the most part. They're all stopgaps that you're doing at point of injury to get them to a higher level of care, mainly bright lights, cold steel, get them on a surgery table. The biggest differentiating factor between, your regular Army medic versus what your Special Forces medic, whether they honestly be the Army, Air Force, whatever, is you're working with that predictive medicine. So not only do you have to know, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but like, your TTRC, your March algorithm, but now you're looking, okay, what now do I have to actually look for, and what do I need to anticipate in the next 24 hours? What do I have to anticipate in the next 48 hours, 72, 96, whatever? Am I prepared to sit on this guy for 2 weeks? If that's the case, we're taking a lot of lessons learned out of Ukraine and seeing like these super long evac times for critical casualties. And that's kind of the big differentiating factor is, your 68 Whiskey's point of injury care. They take care of those stopgaps, they get through their March algorithm, and then they're passing it off to, their battalion surgeon, whoever it is, at their next high level of care. Well, that 18 Delta needs to be prepared to be that next higher level of care. Now, will he eventually get evac'd to, let's say a level 1 trauma center or at least a role 2? Yeah, probably. However, you don't know when that's going to be because, going through that soft realm, and especially with this new focus into large scale combat operations, the days of GWAT are over. So, in GWAT, we got really comfortable with, what's colloquially called in the medical realm, the golden hour. Essentially is you have an hour to get that guy evac'd and up to higher level of care. That's never going to happen at LISCO anymore. Those days of having a helicopter on a 30-minute flight to pick up your guy and evac him, that's never going to happen because the air corridors and the anti-aircraft batteries from the enemy are still active. So now the onus is on that 18 Delta, who's working in the rear, way, way, way behind enemy lines, to figure out, okay, what are the next steps that I need to do to keep this guy alive for this extended period of time so that I can get him to that higher level of care. So that's kind of that big differentiating factor, is looking at that prolonged casualty care environment and being predictive of that, seeing the trends and knowing what's the next thing that this guy is going to have to deal with. Okay, I made my stopgaps, tourniquets on. Okay, fine. That's whatever. Cool. You bought him 8 hours. Okay. What are we moving into in the next 24 that might kill him? What's going to kill him in the next 48 hours? Now I have to deal with infections, that kind of thing. So I know it's kind of a long answer, but that's kind of the biggest differentiating factor, is looking at the predictive medicine.
It's interesting, Mo. You talk about the predictiveness of wounds and casualties and whatnot. What type of wound sets and injuries are you specifically trained to manage as 18 Delta, and how does that training really translate to handling, like you talked about, the prolonged casualty care scenarios like the ones that you run there at the NTC?
So, the biggest, I would say, we can kind of break it down into essentially 4 different categories. I would say multi-system trauma patients. So you see that a lot with blast injuries, obviously, or it could be honestly multiple gunshot wounds. And then, you start looking at burn injuries, whether that be electrical, thermal, or even chemical burns. We dig pretty heavily into our medical pipeline. We start looking at the pathophysiology when it comes to head injuries and dealing with intracranial pressure issues. And then related to that, but not dissimilar to it, is, like neurological shock and seeing the signs and symptoms of that and dealing with that. And then I would say just in general, unstable patients. Because that creates a whole new dilemma that maybe it's not a huge issue at point of injury, but that's going to complicate your treatments as you move into that prolonged field care scenario. Excuse me. The biggest thing kind of moving forward and what that creates in that prolonged field care scenario is, so just for example, let's say, for instance, you're with your team on your Special Forces ODA. One of your guys goes down. 18 Delta is the first guy on the patient, so he does the initial treatment. Okay, cool. Your evac went well, at least from your care under fire is taken care of. Your TTRC, you've got him stabilized at least to the greatest extent that you could. Let's say now you're holed up in a building. You don't know how long you're going to be there. You could be there for 24 hours, 72, whatever. So at that point, yes, the medic is, he's the primary medic for that guy. However, there's a lot more that needs to be done for that patient. It's not just managing the trauma, because the trauma's already been taken care of at this point. Now it's managing the other things, like I was saying kind of earlier in the previous question, of what's going to kill this guy in the next 24 hours. Okay, cool. So now I got to get antibiotics on board. So at this point in time, now you have a single patient. Hopefully you have a single patient. There could be a possibility you have multiple patients. God forbid you have a MASCAL. And that's for a whole nother point of discussion, is, now you got to get antibiotics on board. Now you need to start trending vitals. And so the medic becomes less of, honestly, you become less of a hands-on medic, and you become what I like to kind of classify as a medical manager. And so this is where like the cross training comes in between that medic and his guys on his team. They need to be able to do these slight interventions, i.e., take vitals, give him the narcotics that he's going to need to stay under. Let's say the guy has a crike tube down his throat, or down his trachea. So you've got a guy that's having to bag him because you didn't bring your ventilator. So the medic is now managing the team. Like, he essentially kind of takes over as the doc would in a emergency department, because he's giving the task out to his individual guys that are cross-trained in order to do these small interventions. And it's up to the medic at this point, not really to do like those small interventions, but to kind of look holistically at that patient and say, okay, what is my next course of action? Where are his vitals trending to? Is he starting to show signs of sepsis? Is that tension pneumothorax that I dealt with early on, now am I going to have to do a chest tube at some point in time? Do I have enough narcotics to last me these next 72 hours? And so that's something that we've tried to at least replicate, at least to the greatest extent that we can out at NTC. It's difficult, obviously. We're on a very slight time constraint, just due to the scenario and design in general. But kind of like a standard mode of practice for us is we like to at least have our extended casualty evac times and our prolonged field care scenarios at least encompass a period of anywhere from 48 to 72 hours to really test that medic. And I'll be honest, typically we try to do multi-system trauma patients and multiple patients. And I'll get into this a little bit later. I'm sure you guys probably have questions about it, but typically, maybe not have a MASCAL, but at least create a dilemma type scenario where the medic may have to make the unfortunate decision to discontinue treatment on one of his guys, because if he continues to treat him, he's just going to burn through medical supplies and he's going to die anyways. It's a really rough decision to have to make, but it's a realistic one where, okay, I can continue to treat this guy with everything that I've got for the next 6 hours, and he might die anyways, and I might run out of supplies for these other 3 guys that I have injured, or I can unfortunately make the rough decision to say, hey, we have to discontinue treatment on him because I need to focus on these other 3 guys that I know I can save. So that's kind of how we managed to translate that.
So you talked a little bit about the stopgap stuff that is TCCC, 68 whiskeys, putting tourniquets on, maybe a crike, a needle thoracostomy, chest tube, stopping the bleeding. Now you're in this prolonged casualty care scenario. What is the most critical skill or technique that you relied on to stabilize patients when you have to hold on to them for 28, 48 hours? And from what I'm hearing you say, it's like, it seems like you need to have that experience of knowing, what is the next thing that's going to kill them. But is there any critical skill or technique that you found worthwhile?
I'll be perfectly honest. I can kind of boil it down to actually a very simplistic thing. And it's literally as simple as early vitals tracking and watching the trends and knowing what the signs and symptoms are of those trends. Honestly, and especially noticing it, watching 18 Deltas come through the NTC scenarios, that's really been the biggest differentiation between teams that do really well on a PFC scenario and teams that do really poorly. Is they get vitals, teams that do really, really well do vitals trending immediately. And it's not something a medic is doing. They're already tasking it out to one of their guys to take care of that. And so that's been the biggest differentiator. I know it's a really simplistic thing to say. I wish I could say it's like, oh yeah, be able to do like this intervention, one thing really, really well. But honestly, it really comes down to vitals tracking. and being able to see the patterns in vitals and how they trend, and being able to actually be predictive and see like, okay, based off his vitals and the mechanism of injury, let's say, the guy was in a blast or something like that. You should be able to look at those vitals and look at the trending of your patient and be like, okay, does he have a tension pneumothorax, or is he going into cardiac tamponade? You can find that information for the most part within vitals tracking. And I say early vitals tracking is absolutely key, because, God forbid you hold off vitals tracking on a guy for, whatever, maybe a few hours, maybe you just don't have the ability to mark it down. Now that you are trying to play catch up with that vitals trending tracker, now you're running into the problem of, well, I haven't been able to treat this guy for several hours. Now all of his vitals are crashing. And so I haven't been able to see that trend. I didn't watch whether or not his BP crashed first or his heart rate spiked first. Knowing those small little details is what differentiates the teams that do really, really well. And you can see the medics kind of work through that process and being able to look at it and say like, okay, this is exactly what happened step by step in his vitals. So I know exactly what this next step is that I need to do based off those vitals and based off the mechanism of injury.
It's interesting. You talk about the prolonged field care and making those tough decisions on, hey, am I going to save my buddy and use all my resources, or I could take care of these other three and continue the fight. Those decisions can be tough. And as we move into the age of telemedicine and technology and everything, can you kind of walk us through how telemedicine has been integrated in your scenarios in the NTC? And is that something you guys are doing to help in different scenarios if you just need that reassurance or want to double check something? And what lessons have you learned from that practical application in an austere environment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll start off first by saying when it comes to the 18 deltas that come through here, we don't at any point in time dictate to them that they have to do telemedicine. It's completely onto them. And the specific reason that we don't dictate it to them is we want to see, honestly, if they are going to actually use that as a viable resource. I will say the teams that have done telemedicine have been far more successful during their PFC scenarios. And I think, honestly, the reason is just kind of looking back historically at the teams that have done it. I think, honestly, what it comes down to is, it breaks away from the subjectivity that a medic is probably going to have when one of his teammates is the guy on the operating table. I mean, as a medic, we're taught to try to be as objective as possible and try to get it out of our heads. Like, oh man, I need to do everything I can and waste all my resources to save this guy because he's my brother on my team. But, at the end of the day, there's never a 100% guarantee that you're going to be able to separate yourself from that line of thinking. Like, we like to obviously tell ourselves, because we're soft men, oh no, I got this, man. But I don't think there's honestly a way to really ever separate yourself entirely from that. The nice thing about actually doing telemedicine with a battalion doc or surgeon is you can lay out, that vitals training that you've had. You can lay out the interventions that you've done, over a period of time, given the mechanism of injury, tell him the evac times that you've already taken. And he can look at that purely objectively, and being able to tell you, yes, this is kind of what I am looking at. Plus, I mean, obviously too, there's that reassurance of, if that medic is really trying to fish for, what is this guy going through? And he just can't quite catch it. Because, I mean, it's kind of a rough situation that we are as 18 deltas. Honestly, not even 18 deltas, just special forces guys in general. It's an old adage, but it fits pretty well within our community, is we are absolutely jack of all trades, master of none. We're expected to be proficient at everything that we do. Yes, we're primarily supposed to be an 18 Delta, a medic on a team, but at the same time, I have to, know sniper theory. I have to know mortars. I have to know this. I know that. If I can reach out to an actual medical professional, that is his job. That is his one and only task, is to be a medical professional. that's going to give me a lot more confidence, especially in myself, if I sit in those shoes of, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. If I'm going off the rails and thinking this guy's not going or trending in a direction that I think, he's going to tell me straight up, no, this is what it looks like. I'll kind of give you a good example. We did a PFC scenario out in Nevada. This was about a few months ago. And the team did a really, really good job for their telemedicine. We threw a rather rough scenario at them. Essentially what it was is myself and another 18 Delta dug into the CPGs and started looking at the trends on what a early sepsis patient looks like. And what we kind of found, and this was enlightening to me because actually I didn't know either, and we honestly just wanted to test the medics and see if they were going to actually be able to catch on it too, was, needless to say, the pretty easy signs and symptoms of sepsis is, you start seeing the heart rate increase, and then you see their temperature increase. Pretty simple. What we learned from the CPG was early onset sepsis actually creates a hypothermic effect. Like, you'll actually see a decrease in body temperature before you see those massive fever spikes from the sepsis setting in. And so when we started doing the vitals trending for that PFC scenario, it really threw the medics for a loop, and they didn't know what was happening. And so immediately when they made the decision point of, okay, I am no longer confident in my medical assessment of where this guy is tracking or what is the underlying issue, they immediately reached out to their battalion doc. Battalion doc, unfortunately, wasn't able to actually answer the question either. But he gave them reassurance that while they didn't know exactly what the vital trends were doing, he at least gave them the reassurance that, yes, your interventions up to this point have made sense. You haven't, it's called that old adage of do no harm. They haven't further harmed their patients with their interventions.
Yeah,
hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point, and that is, having somebody else to help with tough pattern recognition, because when you're tracking things and watching things, sometimes it just takes another pair of eyes to say, hey, did you think of this? Or, man, that guy looks sick. He's going to crump pretty soon. And even if you ask that person, how did you know? I'm not sure how I knew. I just knew that they were sick. It's kind of one of those magic things, but having somebody else with that set of experiences. One thing I wanted to find out about is, how well do you think that the Special Operation Forces medics from different services, Army 18 Deltas, Navy Independent Corpsmen, Air Force PJs, how do they integrate during the joint training things that go on at NTC? And do you think that the medical training really aligns enough across the services so they can really fall in with each other without too much of a, hey, you use something different and we use this thing, and we got a protocol for this and you guys do that? How's that work?
I mean, I'll be perfectly honest and frank. We really don't see a lot of other special operations units from the other armed forces do joint rotations with the NTC. Honestly, I think what it comes down to is, I mean, I could talk about this in depth. It's something that NTC, as a whole, needs to work on to actually get the joint force to kind of play ball with NTC. I mean, obviously, it's extremely Army centric. NTC has a few Air Force personnel on base. None of them are medical personnel. They're all TAC-Ps. But as far as I know, we really haven't done any joint operations with any, whether that be Navy SARCs, PJs. Steve, I think you mentioned at one point in time another Air Force medical personnel that actually I hadn't actually heard before.
Yeah, the Air Force, the SOFPs, the Special Operations Forces Medical Elements.
Yeah. I really wish, honestly, I could say that we've had good integration on the joint force as far as medical training and seeing what their capabilities are from a one-to-one standpoint. At least in practice. Now, I can say, Doug, that at least from a training perspective, because the Navy SARCs, the SOIDCs, the Ranger medics, they all go through the exact same medical pipeline that the 18 Deltas do. I know that obviously they are, their capabilities and their medical prowess is going to be on par with the 18 Deltas. And I know that generally speaking, that their TPs are going to basically follow along with ours. Now, that being said, I've had the privilege of working with a few BJs, but I haven't obviously seen their training pipeline. So I can't necessarily say for certain that, I would be able to do one for one. Let's say I did a hot swap with a PJ. I can't necessarily say that, my TTPs and my modus operandi is going to be the exact same as theirs. It's something, honestly, I would like to see NTC push a lot more, is joint training with the other armed forces. I think there's avenues that can be explored, not even just from the medical realm, but just in general. It's something that we've been trying to do a little bit more. Part of our realistic military training environment. So just for your guys's and the listeners that you guys have. So with the special operations training detachment, at least out here at NTC, so we are not just conducting training on NTC. So we have a very, very, very robust realistic military training package built in. So we've got training that we conduct at the Nevada National Security Site. We conduct training out of Coronado, San Diego, Los Angeles. We have multiple agreements with various SWAT agencies, high-risk target interdiction teams from the various SWAT agencies, police departments, fire departments. So we've got the capacity, I think, to actually open that up to the other services. I think it's just someone needs to be brave enough, honestly, to make that giant leap of saying, yes, let's bring in the PJs for this rotation. Let's bring in the Navy SARCs. Let's do some work with an ODA out with the Coast Guard or, the Navy SEALs out at Coronado, and let's make something happen. Obviously, that's going to happen way, 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 way above my pay grade. And obviously, that's going to necessarily need authorization from the commanders of ops group themselves. But I wish I could give you a more concrete answer, but that was kind of my take. Is I would love to see it happen. We just haven't explored it yet, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the joint training aspect of it. If you go back a little bit, back into to my time, in history books, so to say, and there before 9/11, we used to routinely have joint readiness exercises that brought the SF and Rangers and Air Force and everybody together, and you have multilats and bilats, with all the different organizations, and it was literally every quarter. It was every quarter that we would get together and do training and mission plan and ops, and we'd fly with the 160th. The 160th would fly with us. We'd work with our Army Ranger medics. They'd work with us. Help take care of base camp for the SF team, so that medic could focus on the mission, and we'd run the base camp for him. There was a lot more of that back in the day. And obviously, after 9/11, everybody was busy and gone
Laser
and
focus,
actually doing the mission. There was no need to, every 3 months do a joint operation or set up a task force. They were actually executing. So those kind of went away. But I'm not sure if they'll be coming back anytime soon with the new changes that we have that are going out there. But that was a good way to actually see other medic skills. So when you look at the PJs, they go to dive school, they go to airborne school, they go to free fall school, SEER school, paramedic school, and they're really rescue specialists with medical training, but they're also attached to different ODA teams and SEAL teams to be that medic and provide that medical care as well. When you look at some of the special operations forces elements or the SOFMEs, they're more of a clinician, but they also have that critical care and that trauma training. So they could run clinic, they could see patients, prescribe meds. They could treat any kind of trauma that comes in. They're trained in CASEVAC training, critical care, flat paramedic training, foodborne disease, illness, all of that type of stuff that you need to run a base camp. So, there's a lot of different skill sets that are out there. But, as the SOF community continued to grow, I remember going to SOCMIS and our refreshers out of Fort Bragg in a trailer. There wasn't even a schoolhouse. There wasn't even a building. And I tell you, this trailer was probably condemned that they were putting us in when they were out there for 2 weeks. But that community has just grown so much. You see the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse is overwhelmed already.
Absolutely.
It could be 10 times bigger, for all the medics that need to come through. So over years in attrition, some of the smaller organizations and units were kind of forced to, hey, maintain your skill set somewhere else, so to say. But this is kind of what we're expecting you to do. In June of 2021, U.S. SOCOM put together Directive 350-29, which was the Special Operations Forces baseline interoperable standards for medical training, which kind of went across all the services to lay out a basic foundation of these are the basic skills that are expected for medics to have in that soft world, whether you're a 160th medic, or you're an SF medic, or you're a Navy SEAL medic, or you're a PJ, a SOFME, pick a medic, whatever flavor, but this is the baseline skill set. They had a bunch of skills on there. I heard that it's in revision, and it may be coming out a new updated version here in the next 6 to 8 months. But that was kind of the intent of that. So everybody from the services had an idea. Hey, this is what these people bring to the fight. This is kind of the skill set. So this is what you can expect. So when you see that PJ or that medic at the tail of that aircraft, you feel comfortable giving your buddy to them and know that they're going to be in good hands. If that kind of makes sense.
No, absolutely. And honestly, even outside of the soft realm, I think that is something, honestly, that it's something concrete that I think needs to be communicated to the actual conventional force as well. Honestly, one of the difficult things that we kind of run into here is being able to explain to the conventional force what a special operations medic brings to the table as far as, their actual capabilities. Because honestly, I think unfortunately, what a lot of people think is, from the conventional side is they hear, "Oh, I'm the medic. Oh, okay, cool. You take vitals and do IVs. Awesome." So, and I don't blame them. They don't know our pipeline.
Sure.
So, I mean, and you can try to explain it as best we can in person, but honestly, just handing them that packet and saying, "This is everything that this medic can do." I think honestly, that's a huge value added to that conventional force, especially, let's say for instance that, his apprehension is, sending out his guys to partner with an ODA or whatever it may be, out in the deep fight is, I don't have medical capabilities because you guys are operating way beyond the FLOT. Well, maybe that's something as far as like that mitigating factor from risk of mission, risk of force is, okay, now I have somebody on that ODA that I know exactly what they are capable of as far as treating my guys should they get into a tick.
Yeah. And you could probably even use that as a great recruiting tool, if you're running them 68 whiskeys or whatnot, and they tell them, hey, this is what we do. And they're like, hey, that sign me up and ready to go after that.
It's funny you mention that, actually. It's funny you mention that, actually. So 11th ACR is the conventional forces here. They play the OP4 for all the rotational elements. I managed to actually meet a bunch of their medics during one of the rotations, because we'll use them for our OP4 against the ODAs that come here. And I ended up with a bunch of medics, and I happened to mention, we got bored one day. We were waiting for the ODA to hit a target, and I was just like, you know what, I'm going to run through some medical classes with them and just kind of see where they're at. And a lot of them honestly felt really unsure about their medical training and what they had learned. And so I started throwing little pointers here and there of, hey, yes, doctrinally, you were taught this way to do this one intervention. Well, honestly, if you do it this way, it's faster and more effective. And so I just, you kind of see that little spark in their eyes of just like, holy cow, like, this is a different mode of medicine that I didn't really think about, because they're so regimented from the 68 whiskey level that you're really not allowed to think outside the box. It's not within your purview of medical treatments. And so I'm actually trying to put together like a little kind of 2-day like medical training symposium for those guys, about 5 individuals, that I'm going to run them through like a didactic portion. Unfortunately, just kind of death by PowerPoint. Just to kind of get the point across. And then the next day, I'm going to end up trying to put them actually through like trauma scenarios, just like would happen in trauma too.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. You talk about thinking outside the box, and sometimes they're stuck on that. I got to do this because it's black and white, and that's what I've always been told.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of this interview, where Mo outlined what makes 18 Deltas uniquely trained and how prolonged casualty care is trained at the National Training Center and Joint Readiness Training Center. In next episode, Mo, Steve, and Doug will talk about non-standard CASEVAC, medical cross-training, and the essential traits for a combat medic. Thank you for listening to Off the Radar, where RSOF prepares for conflict. Like,
subscribe, and share on your listening platform. Actions will determine the outcome.